Okay, I ended the last unit making the strong point that the creation story of Genesis 1 is not so much about a beginning point where matter came into being, but it's about God giving this creation a name, a function, a purpose, about Him taking undefined things, forming them, defining them, and assigning them purpose. And maybe think a moment back into your own life. None of us can remember our beginnings. My earliest memory, I was probably 3 years old or something that I can remember. We all grew up with a gap, with not knowing how and where we started, and we were all fine. Nobody runs around going to the psychiatrist and saying, oh no, I cannot, I don't know where I had my beginning. It's something that has been told to us, it's still a bit fuzzy, and we are fine with that. But we run around with deep problems if we don't know where we belong, if we feel we don't have a name, we don't have a purpose, we don't have a function, we don't have a place in this world. And this is actually what the Genesis story addresses. This is what God does, and I find that amazing. We also talked about that Genesis 1:1 is not actually a beginning point. So it's not the first element in the story, but it's kind of like a title. And I want to take some time to look with you at the literary structure of Genesis 1, because that will help us identify some other rather important points. The Bible works a lot, and the Jewish literature, with things that are hidden. Things are not always obvious. They are ambiguous. They're not always clear to see, just like Jesus' parables. And so for the Easterner, true learning is not so much giving you information, like partly I do it right now, but it's more about discovery. That means when people write their stories, and also later the stories in Genesis 1, there is something that the author wants you to discover. And it's not going to blink in bold lights on top of the story, but it's buried in this story. And often, and I'm not talking so much about this, often it comes through things that are rather disturbing. When we read something, we say, "Whoa, this is weird. Why is that?" Now, the trouble is, at least in the West again, we have a tendency to exactly in that moment say, okay, let's just skip over it. Let's not talk about it. This is weird. This doesn't fit into my theology. I don't know. And we go on. But that would be the blinking lights where we should actually go and dig deeper. There are also some other literary devices that people use, and the two main ones that are used are chiasm and repetition. A chiasm is when the author tells a story, then another one, then another one, then another one, then you feel, haven't we had that before? And then you realize other things are repeated. And often the treasure is in the center of a chiasm, and sometimes also at the ends. And another element which we are more familiar with is repetition, which then we should look at parallels and should discover a deeper meaning in things that are juxtaposed next to each other. We have that also we have that all over the Bible. In Genesis we have that. We have, for example, 4 elements that are repeated. We have the creation of things, and then later the creation gets repeated with a new creation, with a new world coming out of the waters after Noah. And we have again a story about a fall, about problems, about a tragedy. We have a garden, we have a fall, we have nakedness, we have shame, we have a curse. All these things are actually repeated. And that means we should compare these stories and look what's going on. And we also have chiasm, for example, Noah. Sometimes there are little chiasms and big ones. Noah has a big chiastic movement, which is quite intense, with something in the center. But this is not about Noah, this is about Genesis. So let's look at that. When we look at Genesis, we see the design structure acts as an envelope around this creation of 6 days. We have a summary prologue, an opening, and it has 7 words in Hebrew. And then we have an exposition of this prologue, and it's 3 lines, and they have 2 times 7 words. And this pattern is then picked up again at the end. So actually the chapter division is really unfortunate, because this first Genesis poem only ends in chapter 2, verse 3. So we have, like we had the prologue, we also have a summary epilogue, and we have an exposition of that again in 3 lines. And it would be too far to explain that in detail, but in Hebrew it's quite amazing, and it's also very, very clear. The whole section is really a work of art. It matches each other. We have 7 words in verse 1, 14 words in verse 2, 21 words in the conclusion, and then 5 words that hyperlink everything back into the first line. And so Genesis 2 verse 1 is not another action in the sequence, but now it's in a conclusion that looks back. And since it matches Genesis 1:1, we could conclude that the function of Genesis 1:1 also is an introduction summary of what follows. And the real beginning of the story is Genesis 1 verse 2. Some other things, when we hear the word create, it's the Hebrew word bara, but there's a homonym in Hebrew. Homonyms are words that are written with exactly the same letters, but they have different meanings. In English, an example would be lead, the metal, and lead, which is guiding somebody. It's written exactly the same, it has different meanings. In German, it could be Tau or modern. A word that is written the same and it has different meanings, however you see it. And bara is one of these words. It means create, but you could also read it as saying separate. And we can see that a lot of creation of God has actually to do with the separation of things. There is not a big difference between creating something and making something. We might distinguish this, but in Hebrew it's not so much the case. And like I mentioned, the best picture I can give you is that of a potter who takes things that mean nothing, have no form or shape, are good for nothing, and then gives them form and shape and purpose. We could say it signifies that something is there that hasn't been there in this form before. At the end, we see that it says God completed on the 7th day his works which we had made. And then in the end it says which God created to make. They are used interchangeably already. Also there we have a very interesting pattern which will become very important later throughout the rest of the Bible. And that is the Hebrew, the words for 7 and the word for completing or full are spelled again with the same letters as a homonym. So it's a wordplay which introduces this word 7 as a notion of completeness and fullness. And this frame is important because it shows the full journey from chaos and disorder to completeness and fullness. If you look at the 6 days which are in the middle here, we can see that they are arranged in a specific pattern. And I want to show that to you as well. You see these days, and I think most of us are familiar with the order of things, how things are going. And we can see, you remember in the beginning, the world was wild and waste. It was formless and it was empty. And what God does in the first 3 days is that he actually forms things. And he does that mainly by separation. He separates light from darkness. He separates the waters above from the waters below. He separates the waters from the dry land. And so he gives shape to the world. And then we have the second 3 days where God is mainly filling things. So he takes care of the tohu vavohu, of the emptiness, of the formlessness and emptiness, by forming things and filling them. And these days also correspond with each other. So day 4 and day 1 and day 4 is the same thing. It's light and darkness, and we see God fills this area with the sun and moon and the stars. On the second day, God separates the waters above from the waters below, and on day 5 he fills them, the waters above, with birds in the air and the waters below with fish. And then we have day 6, where God obviously creates the land, and then on day 3, and then on day 6 he fills the land with creatures, with animals and with land creatures. And then on day 7 God rests. Obviously, we can look a little deeper into the text. I want to show you just some parallels. You can see that here. So we can discover some more parallels. On day one, God himself provides the light of his divine glory that meets the darkness, and he fits the darkness within a larger purpose. We might think, if darkness is bad and God comes, what does he do? He destroys the darkness. He eliminates the darkness. Sometimes that's how we pray. You know, get rid of the darkness, and when God's light comes, all the darkness flees. But when you look, what he does is he doesn't eliminate darkness. God gives a boundary to darkness. He limits darkness, and he makes it fit into a larger divine purpose. God names it, he defines it, and he limits its scope by containing it in a cycle of darkness and light, of day and night. It suddenly even serves a purpose. In the night we rest, for example. In the night nothing happens, but it's not as threatening as it has been before. We know there is something that comes afterwards, and we can go through it. And maybe I want to say that just from a pastoral point of view, it's also, we learn a lot about how God deals with dark things. Dark things in the history of Israel. We think of Joseph, where God kind of makes something good out of it in the end. But he deals like that also in our own lives. When day 1 and day 4, when you compare them, you can see clearly the parallel vocabulary. You see how God's attention goes back to the heavenly realm. We have kind of these 3 areas. You remember the old cosmology, that you have the heavens above, very high, then you have the heavens under the rakia and the water, and then you have the land. This is what is addressed here, and we are now in the really upper realm. He fills it, and in this case, with lamps or with lights. God makes lights or lamps. It's the same word that is later used for the menorah in the tabernacle and in the temple. And the actually nameless stars. In Canaan culture and also around, the sun and the moon were clear gods. The sun was called Shemesh, the moon Yareach, and both were corresponding Canaanite deities. And I think this is the reason why Genesis 1 explicitly does not give name to sun and moon, at least not yet. Later on they are named, but not here. Here they're called lamps. So there's no confusion that they might be rivaling deities. Now, something that we often miss, and that is very interesting, what God does on day 1, where he separates light and darkness, now on day 4, this is what the lights are doing. God is handing over authority of separating light and dark. And the lights are called rulers. Let me see if I can find it and show it to you. It's a bit smaller here. God made the lights to separate the day from the night. This is something that the God did in the beginning. And then he says, God made 2 great lights, the great light to rule the day and the small light to rule the night. We are very much aware later on, when it comes to humans, how God commands the humans to rule on the earth below here. But we see that in the heavenly realm, there is authority being delegated to the lights. Now, something that you probably have never thought about, but that was very clear to ancient Near Eastern people, when they looked at the sky and they looked at the stars and at the host of heaven, they didn't see big gas bulbs, but for them they were spiritual beings. The stars, and it's not exactly the same, but let's use this New Testament term, angels, are the same. It says in Luke 2, when Jesus was born, that the host of heaven came and they were singing. And so when you think about the term host of heaven, we use it sometimes to mean the stars, but sometimes we mean it to mean the heavenly armies. And this is exactly the same for an ancient person. So God delegates a rule in the heavenly realm to beings that are kind of unreachable for us, that are up there. And they should be signs. They should point to God's rule. They should represent God's rule in the heavenly being, in the heavenly realm. And you remember that later on, or maybe we come to this, we should represent God's rule down on earth. They are called rulers. What's also interesting, and for us it's not so, but it's hugely important for the Jewish they should rule and they should separate. And it says, for he made them signs and for festivals and for days and years. So they are signs pointing to God, but they also separate the festival times. And in the Jewish calendar, this is hugely important later on. Very, very important. The whole liturgical calendar, all the things that God says, the whole ordering of time. We are sometimes more concerned about the ordering of space, but this is the order of time and how it is separated. And this is a rule that has been delegated there. Okay, let's have a look at day 2 and day 5. When you look at this, you also see clear parallels. God orders the middle realm that would exist in between the skies above and the land below. And he fills it also with inhabitants. Up there are birds. The waters below swarm with sea creatures and monsters, actually, while the birds inhabit the realm above. The monster is something that we sometimes miss a little bit. Let me see, where is it? God created the great sea monsters. Now, this is a more literal translation. Most translations that you have might not have that. You might remember that in the ancient worldview, there was this great and fierce and dangerous sea creature that was in the waters around. It's not our realm of living. When we are in the waters, we are in danger. And there is creatures that are way bigger than we are. The Leviathan in Job, there's a big description where it says, can you deal with it? And sometimes they translate it like the great whales or, I don't know, hippopotamus or something. This is not what the Hebrew word says. It's clearly a monster, and it was clearly a part of all these creation stories. The point that is so important is it's a creature. It's something that God made. Yes, it will kill you. Yes, it will eat you up. Yes, you have no chance. But God made it, and God can tame it, and God can give you wisdom how to avoid it and how not to go there. Again, it appears later several times in the biblical story. There's an extra element on day 5, and that is God's blessing over the living creatures. He's summoning them to be fruitful and to multiply. So their existence and their multiplication is not a given, but it depends on the blessing of God. Notice that there was not this blessing and command to multiply when it came to the stars, when it came to the heavenly beings. This is something now only proclaimed over the sea creatures and the living creatures that fly. And then we have day 3 and day 6. God creates one last environment, the land, which emerges out of the water. Day 6 also has a bonus act. And we see that towards the end, because God makes vegetation and fruit trees. This bonus focuses on the fruitfulness of the land, specifically in that. And in day 6 has a parallel design. We also have this bonus thing. God focuses on the land. He creates inhabitants. Both plants and animals actually come out of the ground. And first God focuses on the animals and then on humanity, who are the divine image givers. And then this bonus element is that the vegetative plants and the fruit trees are assigned for food for the animals and for the humans. I want to make a quick worldview point. When you read the text, you will see that God says the earth shall bring forth creatures. So the earth should continue this process of bringing forth animals and diversity. And I want to say that from a biblical point of view, there is room for, I wouldn't say maybe macroevolution, but for microevolution. There is room for diversity, there's room for variety, mutations. The earth should bring forth. God says continue. It's not done, it's not closed, this whole process, but it's still ongoing. And I find that very interesting. It's something that I didn't see in the beginning. The days follow the narration order of darkness and light, evening and morning. And yes, and we talked already about in Genesis 2, God separates also Adam and Eve, but then they are supposed to become one flesh again through covenant. And it seems that the creative power of God can splinter out an infinite number of entities that become unified again. And so we see this forward symmetry in the text of the days of A, B, C, and then A1, B1, C1, day 1, 2, 3, and then the corresponding days 4, 5, and 6. And so we should compare these things. You can see this also in the conclusion, where it says, and so were completed the skies and the land and all their hosts. And so this is what we have. We have first the skies, and then we have the land. Sorry, here we go. We have the skies and the land, and then we have the host of the skies, and then we have the hosts of the land, which is the humans and the animals. And so God addressed the tohu vabohu in a very explicit order. And I think that's just a genius how this is done, how God addresses the problems of disorder and the problems of emptiness. Now, interestingly, Genesis 1 is a double origami. Here we can see how you can fold it this way, how you can put one day on day 4, 2 on 5, and 3 on 6. But there's another way to fold this. There's another parallel structure that we can discover, and also that has meaning for us. You could fold this whole thing also upwards. And when we just look at the first 3 days, days 1, 2, and 3, we see the structure it's quite interesting. On days 1 and day 3, God is addressing the two most iconic images of disorder, chaos and death in the biblical story, and that is darkness and the waters. They were already paired in Genesis 1 verse 2. And so we should see them as corresponding images of anti-creation. So when we are battling with the waters, and they appear over and over in the story, they appear in the Psalms, the waters cry out, the waters lift themselves up. You find the waters in the Exodus story. You find them over and over again. You find them in Isaiah, the nations, the roaring waters. This is the battle down below, but this is a corresponding battle with light and darkness in the heavenly realm. And I want to point that out. I'm teaching also on spiritual warfare, and I try to do this from the biblical text. And this is something, at least in the West, which we are like, yeah, it's too fuzzy, let's not talk about it. Actually, Genesis already wants to point out that there are parallels, as in heaven, so on earth, binding in heaven, same battles going on. And we see that in the structure. And then we have this middle area. And again, if you have time, you can look at this more, the way how long passages are, which blessings are pronounced, which parallels are made. It's a pretty clear sign. Day 2 is kind of set apart and has the most elaborate, repetitious and lengthy command and fulfillment structure. But these two halves match each other. You kind of wonder, why is it so long? And then you kind of come away with this awareness that heaven and earth are mirror realities, and that God's conflict with the darkness is the foundational image which matches our conflict with the chaos waters. And God's victory over the darkness and over the waters in both cases happens by speaking a word. Day 2 focuses on God splitting the waters, again by speaking a word, but it's then followed by another act of creation as God separates it. And all of these images, they will be developed throughout the rest of the biblical narrative. So we have the waters, the darkness, death, and enemies, they're all connected. And we have the dry land, where we can live, we have light, we have life, we have refuge. Israel walked through the dry land, through the sea. We have the image of God splitting the waters to create life, God's victory over chaos and evil. When he splits the water, when he creates new things coming out of the water and through the water. This whole image, which in the end ends up in baptism, starts already in Genesis, and that's pretty amazing. And then we have the same when we look again at the structures of day 4, 5, and 6. God's delegated rulers mirror each other. So on day 4, both sun and moon function as a pair that rules the day and night. And notice that the stars are not included in that delegated rule. The stars are the part that is to be ruled, the darkness and the night. And similarly, on day 6, we have the man and the woman, and they are a ruling pair over the land and the animals. And it's really interesting. This last point brings us to compare the objects in the heavenly and earthly realm that are subjected to the rule. So the stars should be ruled, the animals should be ruled, and both of these come together in Genesis 3. We have a creature that belongs to the stars, to the heavenly realm, but also to the animal realm, and it should be ruled. And it is not, and we come to problems there. A side note, one thing that for the first time made a bit of sense is I remember that, I don't know where it is, Paul talks about man and woman, and he says that man reflects the light of God and woman reflects the light of man. It's when he talks about woman and hair and all of this. And I was always wondering, where does he have that from? Now, when you see that sun and moon are compared to man and woman, you could say, oh, the sun reflects the light and the moon reflects the light of the sun. And that's why Paul talks about man and woman there. Now, you might agree or you might disagree, but I think this is where Paul actually got it from. Okay, so when we look at these structures on top of each other, then we see that we can split the whole thing in both ways. In this literary origami. And that means that even though the events on the dry land are not the only thing important happening, the rulers above are also important, and there is some kind of mirrored relationships there. And with one axis we have the ordering and the hosts with wild and waste, and on the other one we have heaven and earth. And so it says, so were completed the skies and the land and all of their hosts. So to end, and we want to come back, sorry I come back here. In the beginning we had, in the pre-creation, this unholy trinity, we could say, the wilderness, the void and emptiness, the darkness and the chaos waters, also represented through, for example, the chaos creature, the monster in the water. But God combats this, all this evil, all these things. In Isaiah, we later on see that this tohu vavohu, this chaos, is not just brought forth by creation waters, but also by human evil. When they come, when enemy armies come and destroy everything and flatten it and turn it to rubble. So this pre-creation state, or this uncreation, this bringing chaos back, bringing disorder back, getting fullness away to emptiness again. This can happen through the natural things, if God is not upholding it and protecting it, but it also happens through humans who invade and who do things, who rule badly, we could say. And they don't rule in the image of God, bringing forth order, but they don't rule. And then all the other chaoses take over again. Give me a moment, I want to quickly see if there's something else that I need to say. No, I think that's fine for now. One thing that I want to say, why I find this so important, and I think I mentioned it quickly at the beginning already. Nowadays, when we evangelize, we go to people and we tell them about Jesus and we tell them about the cross. And we say, Jesus died on the cross so you could be reconciled with God, you can get rid of your sin, of your guilt, you can come back, and what we mean is you can come back to the state before the fall. But the problem is that we have no real idea what this means, because we have never studied Genesis 1 and 2, we will come to chapter 2 as well, in this light. And I would say that nowadays in postmodernity, most people don't run around and say, oh, I feel so guilt-ridden. I want to get rid of my sin. I'm wrong and I need to be reconciled with God. I think more people are running around and say, I don't know, I have no purpose in life. Where do I belong? What should I do? What is everything good for? Is there hope? Is there anything we walk towards? And this is what Genesis 1 and 2 address and answer. Or we could also say in Christian terms, once you are brought back to this state, well, what then? What is your task? And I think our task is to take things that are nothing and bring forth more and more complexity. If I would describe it in musical terms, you could say you have a Buddhist Om, which is like nothing. And then now we come and we shape it and we make bo, 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 and then maybe you're laughing. I know the canon from Pachelbel is something that people know, but it becomes more and more complex and more beautiful. And it's like you end up with an orator, with Bach, with something that is just, it's more and more complex. It's like creating civilization. We now joke and we say, oh, it was our brightness and our evolution that brought us from the Stone Age to iPhones. But this is the rule of God. This is dividing things, separate them, and then make them relate again, not just separate them against each other, but like man and woman, and then complement and work together and build something. So the whole biblical story begins in a garden, but it ends in a city, in a culture, in a civilization. And I think most of us, I mean, we are doing this via Zoom or video, we all enjoy the good things that civilization brings. We know it is a blessing, but we should never forget that it is fragile, that it can collapse, that it's not just a watch that has been turned, but there are chaos powers of unbeing things. I don't know how else to say it. The word evil, we can later discuss this, but chaos, non-existence, non-formlessness, rubble, dung. I don't know how else to say it. These are forces that are there in the world. And if humans don't rule with God as his image bearers, then this will not continue. It might not even be upheld, but it might collapse again. And we have seen that in history as well. Okay, that was a long session, and maybe we should stop here and see if there are any questions that you might have.